we're teaching that somehow there's some magic in the notation, the intervallics there that produces the aesthetics of classical music. When it was always improvisation, it was always the inclination of the student to just go on the piano and begin to play. That's the true birthplace of music, and all the composers really start there, and then they give us this other form that becomes what's glorified. But that's sort of like it's a crystallization. That's the best way I can.
But it's also necessary because you have to your piece, Song for Humanity.
Oh, wow.
How many singers and instruments did you end up writing for?
Wow. So Song for Humanity was performed by the Boulder Symphony. It's probably 60 musicians strong there. And then they had the Boulder Chorale, which is 150 voices.
Okay, so you got to synchronize all that stuff.
I had the benefit of Beethoven's Ninth Symphony being performed on that concert. So of course they brought out, the full resource of the community to perform the piece. Thanks to Beethoven, but it was an amazing experience, that piece.
So there has to be a certain synchronization and regimentation when you're dealing with, when you're dealing with ensembles.
Yes.
So it's understandable why the classical tradition would say, it's all there on the paper. The composers, the conductor's telling you how to perform it. Get in line.
This is true. And this has been my experience in the actual classical music world. So the conductor and the composer and what's written on the page is honored. And I think a lot of that has to do with, the composers that are being performed. So again, this music has a history, whether it's hundreds of years or just being commissioned by a world-class orchestra. The aesthetic of what we're going to produce as part of this music has to be guided by the best intentions of the composer and the conductor, and that's what's on the page. Yes, but at the same time, where is the real power there? Is it the fact that they're adhering to the music, or are they really trying to capture? Like, the best orchestras are going to find something that's not written there, and that's what makes them the world class. Because if you can take a high school orchestra and play the symphony, and they're going to get the notes, they're going to get the rhythms, but did they really get the piece?
True enough.
So we're always striving to get beyond the page, and I think there is something to be said about honoring what's written, but again, that points to something that's beyond what can be written.
William Grant Still, right, the Dean of African American Composers. He's actually a relatively new discovery for me, which is deeply pleasurable in that he's one of the great American composers, and rather troubling that I'd never heard of him, and I have some musical literacy. But Three Visions, Summerland, the second movement, absolutely gorgeous piece. I'm sure you're familiar with it. What's black about that?
So, respectfully, that's the wrong question.
Okay.
I think a lot of times when we listen to music by black composers, there needs to be something black about it, right? Because it can be seen as an exotic feature if you're not used to seeing or accepting blacks within a particular art form. But you have to understand that it's music. If it's pastoral, if it's soothing, if it's of the aesthetic that we hear in Steele's piece, then that could bespeak any number of emotions and thoughts and layers of nuance that are beyond the experience of just being someone who's black. Yes, it's important to honor that heritage and certainly still would be proud of being a black person. But that doesn't necessarily mean that it has to be instilled in his piece anymore than we would expect a white composer to say, okay, well, what's white about this thing that you just wrote? So I understand where the question comes from, but I think it comes from a place that is still trying to reconcile the black composer as opposed to just accepting the composer and therefore accepting the piece.
Still himself in the earlier part of his career used black composer to his advantage.
He should have.
The Afro-American Symphony and references to spirituals. And then there are other people like R. Nathaniel Dett, who based his whole musical career on that on that strategy. So it's an understandable question. But I can see how the argument I hear you making is when classical music is defined as a white creation and a white preserved, that is exclusionary by nature, and it's not true. So when you ask of a composition like so much of Still's writing, well, what's black about that? That's part of that same strategy. It's exclusionary. When you have in front of you the evidence of an African American composer who clearly doesn't respect those boundaries and has no meanings for him.
He's writing a piece of music. He's expressing who he is and you know what that is.
But how widely understood or accepted is that amongst the black community themselves? Do they not make the same mistake?
I think it's widely accepted in the black community. I think within our culture, we're very able to just appreciate the music. I think the larger boundary is with white culture because of the things that we've talked about, because of them coming to it from a lens of this being exclusive to some story that they were told. That somehow when they finally do get to experience that and it starts to seep in the gravity of that, what they're like, well, black people, are you aware of how amazing this is? We're like, yeah.
But when black music is presented to the younger generation, to jazz, it's ragtime and all the way up, it's popular forms all the way up to hip hop. Nobody talks about William Grant Still.
Well, okay, so let's contextualize this a little bit more. Okay, so William Grant Still was a young composer. William was in his 20s. He writes the stuff that we hear. Okay, so that was the hip hop then. Then we get to jazz. That's its own thing. That again, young people doing that, and now we have hip hop, young people doing that, and then there are other forms and genres. So I think it it can be a little unfair to expect generations to just fully embrace the music of previous generations, even if that music is absolutely amazing. It does take a certain amount of education. It does take a strategy to introduce these art forms. So in the same way that I would introduce jazz, I'm going to introduce that to, if I'm coming to a hip hop generation, I gotta first come to them in the language of hip hop. Then I bring that in, and then I bring in the jazz, and if I'm coming to them, with classical, same strategy, and then eventually they will come to it. I'll share an experience that I had. Briefly, I was with a producer friend, and his assistant was there, young black guy. So we're both a little older than he is. He's basically been raised in hip hop, but we were reviewing some of the music that we were writing for this film, and then we just started playing a whole bunch of old school music and film music and just all this. and he just lit up. It was like he had discovered a whole new world.
Yes.
So I think the younger generation, they want this. They just don't know it exists.
Right, right.
But once they get a chance to finally get a full taste of it, they'll fall in love with it, just like William did,
I'm even older than you are, quite a bit older. And so jazz for me was pretty widespread when I was growing up. One of the best-selling albums of the day was Dave Brubeck's Time Out, and then Miles Davis' Time. These were Miles Davis' Kind of Blue. These were bestsellers. So that doesn't happen anymore, because jazz is like, not to say that it isn't a vibrant and living tradition still, but people who are coming up, unless they have a special interest, a special connection. I don't know if it's taught in the classroom, but less than 5% of the record market or the recording market is devoted to jazz these days.
Here's an interesting thing, though, to think about, okay? So, yes, jazz had, its heyday where it was the most popular form of music. Jazz has a lot more competition today, right? But jazz, and by extension classical music, are some of the most sampled types of music in hip-hop.
You're going to have to show me where classical music is sampled.
As a matter of fact, one of the biggest, this is a bit of trivia, one of the biggest samples in hip-hop is called an orchestral hit. It's literally called the orchestra hit.
Okay.
It goes all the way back to the 80s. That is a sample of Stravinsky, I believe it's Firebird.
Mm-hmm.
But it doesn't sound like Firebird because it's just one hit, or maybe I think it's Firebird. But anyway, that one hit into being a sample that it was.
What do you mean a hit?
It's a hit. So in an orchestral hit, when every instrument in the orchestra plays, one note at the same time and creates sort of this big blast. It's like a thud. It's like there's a huge
Firebird's
note
filled with those at the end.
Right. So you get this big hit, that hit gets sampled, and it becomes like this big hit that was resampled during the 90s, and there's a whole doc on this on YouTube. Cool. But the point is, I think audiences, that listen to sampled music, that listen to these forms that are beyond jazz, are still getting the rhythms and the melodies. They're just getting them in these compartmentalized forms. And so they do appreciate the aesthetic. It's just the medium of delivery has now changed. And there does have to be some work to do in terms of bringing the full piece back into light beyond the sample. But even just the idea that the sample is that attractive, that it's the thing driving that energy, that love is still there for that sound that is jazz.
Or classical.
Yeah.
Okay. I want to wrap up with a point, something I've learned in the course of this conversation, and then you get to have the last word. You've shown me where the thinking, the compartmentalized thinking, which I grew up with and which I accepted as fact, this history that I wrote about in the article. I see where that is part of the problem and not part of the solution. Somehow, those names that I mentioned and that history needs to be known, and I don't see where the counter narrative has been written yet. So there's that. The other thing is that as a result of the miseducation, if you will, of the populace in general about classical music, it has not been sufficiently integrated into an understanding of what black music is.
Oh. Wow. Robert, I think that's a profound realization. I'm glad you're able to come to that. I think these kind of conversations are very important because what they do is first they explore just the humanity of these questions. We are curious about how things come to be. We are lovers of history. We're trying to sort out what it means to have gone through the past that we've shared. And at the same time, there is a lens that can filter what that is. And I think at the core of that is a heart for the music and a heart to discover where it comes from. I think that's really what we're trying to get at. You know, when we look at, blacks in classical music, when we look at blacks in the other genres that we talked about, jazz, if you want to go all the way up to hip hop, there is something very powerful there. And often it does come out of a sort of through a struggle, through a protest, and like, okay, how does that meld into the bigger history of what it is? And at the core of that, it's their people expressing themselves despite.
Yeah.
You can put after that ellipsis there, and I think that's something that we can all tap into. So if there's anything that you get from me, that's the part that I'm looking at first, though. What were they expressing? Because I think about black composers, and as a black composer, the thing that would be most important to me is the legacy of my music and what that music was trying to express. Mm-hmm. And I know that eventually that's going to be beyond me. Like, it's not 100 years from now, I will have no say.
But you don't write for the future.
I don't write for the future, but I do. I know, I understand that lineage. Mm-hmm. I write for the future in the same way that Beethoven did, mm-hmm. Because at some point, someone's going to come to this, and then they're going to say, what is this? And how do I integrate myself with it,
In a tradition.
In a tradition, or just as a person, or as a symphony. People live vicariously through musical experiences, and so we're the original high in that sense. We're giving people a feeling, we're giving people an emotion, we're giving them, a wave to ride. And if you create that experience for people, they're gonna want to know what that was. So I think, whatever I put to the page, I want that to be conveyed. And since those composers are not here to sort of make that argument for themselves, we have to make that argument for them sometimes. We can't let them get lost in the sauce of what was around them. Mm-hmm. We got to get to the core of what they were really trying to do.
Mm-hmm. So, for the ancestors, huh?
For the ancestors.
Thank you, Jose. It was a great conversation.
I enjoyed it.